well, Shay, you are my guest for today. Can you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and what you do to kind of help combat sex trafficking, or what you want to do to help combat sex trafficking?
Sure, of course. So thank you for talking with me today. Obviously, my name is Shea Rhodes, and I am the director and the co-founder of Villanova Law School's Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for a very long time
Hmm.
and spent about 10 years of my career prosecuting cases for the city of Philadelphia. And I realized towards the end of my career that Pennsylvania did not have a good sex trafficking law. And in fact, nobody really talked about sex trafficking in Pennsylvania as a crime. And I learned about it because I was involved with a diversion program specifically designed for women who were considered recidivist prostitutes, meaning they had 3 or more convictions for the crime of prostitution. And in diversion programs, although you are the prosecutor, you're part of a team. And there is a lot of, interaction with the people who are participants in the court. They're defendants. And it's very different from prosecuting someone, in a trial type of situation. They're represented by a lawyer. You can never speak with them. Otherwise, you could have a violation of your ethical, the rules of professional responsibility. It's unethical to talk to someone who
Yeah.
is represented by counsel. And just in learning from these women, sort of the why, right? Motive for committing crimes is always something that I was concerned about as a prosecutor. When you go to trial, juries always want to know the why. And I could never wrap my brain around why prostitution was something that we were even prosecuting people for, because there's nothing the criminal justice system could do to punish someone for a crime that could in any way, shape, or form possibly be worse than what was happening on the
Yeah.
streets of Philadelphia. And I started listening to them and talking with them, and they were talking about things like pimps. And I was like, wait, but that's sex trafficking. And it was really eye-opening to me. Like, a lot of the women didn't end up in street prostitution or prostituting, out of strip clubs because of, that was their dream in life when they were a little kid, what they wanted to grow up to be. It was, they'd been victims of violence. They were forced to do things by boyfriends or people who cared about them. There was so much trauma involved in co-occurring substance use disorder. And I didn't think we should be prosecuting them, let alone if they should be, involved in a diversion program. But it was helping them, right? Giving them access to
Yeah.
rehab and things like that. And I just started digging and digging and taught myself a lot about trafficking and the different state laws and what was involved in the lingo and the life. And honestly, kind of came to the end of my career being made fun of by a lot of lawyers,
Yeah.
my fellow prosecutors and colleagues and supervisors, and thought, you know what? At that point, had paid off my entire law degree, was
Hmm.
like, my loans from school are done. I own my degree, and this isn't something that I think I can do anymore from just being a line prosecutor. So I left my job and approached law schools about, doing what I do now at the CSC Institute, which is policy work and direct legal services. And um, was able to find private funding to get it off the ground. And we just finished our 7th academic year here at Villanova. So um, that is why I do what I do. I met several women who really changed my life in the court and
Hmm.
um, changed my, I don't know if they changed my perspective. They did change my perspective on some things, but they really forced me to reconcile like why it is that I became a lawyer in the first place, and
Yeah.
whether or not I was accomplishing those goals by being a line prosecutor. And um, so that is sort of why I left the DA's office. And then when my co-founder and I were figuring out what we were going to try to accomplish, we do a lot of things. We do training and education on prostitution policy, on trafficking laws. We engage with our legislature here in Pennsylvania and other state legislators to write laws, to change laws, to, remove laws from the books.
Yeah.
We do have a client base. We help women, and it's primarily women. We've had a couple clients who are men or trans women who, they have criminal records, and we try to help them clean up their criminal records and move forward with their life.
And about that, like cleaning the records of a survivor of sex trafficking or of a prostitute, why is that so important for those survivors of prostitution or sex trafficking? Why is it so important that their resumes are completely cleaned of all the criminal charges they have received in the past?
So with any aspect of being criminalized, there's stigma attached to it. And specifically with prostitution, even though I believe that prostitution is a crime of violence being committed to another person, not by the person it's happening to. When you have a criminal record, and even if you're in the life and you're criminalized, there are so many collateral legal consequences. I mean, you lose your children, you lose housing opportunities. You have landlord tenant issues. You might lose your driver's license or your medical card. You might not have a bank account. You might have your tax return received if you do ultimately get a job because you owe costs and fines or hadn't paid taxes in the past. Or you might have child support ordered against you that you had no idea you even had. But one of the things that's so important for someone to get out of the life is that they have safety, right? That's all part of what being trauma informed is about. Is the first tenet is safety. Is your client safe?
Yeah.
And safety is physical safety, right? You need a safe place to live, but it's also, I have to take that email down, otherwise it's just going to bang. I apologize.
No, you're good. You're good.
It's emotional safety. And if you're not physically safe, how are you going to get into an emotional safe space? And a lot of landlords do not want to rent to people who have a record for prostitution. They think that they're going to be prostituting out of their, apartment that they owned, or landlords will see prostitution on a record and try to take advantage of that and say, hey, instead of paying me rent this month, do you want to pay me in sexual services? It's all incredibly stigmatizing. You can't get into school.
Yeah.
You can't get federal loans to go to school. A lot of employers don't want to hire people with prostitution on the record, especially if they're working with kids, because they think it's, a crime of immorality, and, they're going to teach kids terrible things. There's just so many legal consequences that people who are exiting prostitution or who are survivors of sex trafficking, really need lawyers to help them navigate a system. Also, after they've exited, become strong and decided to, speak openly or publicly and get paid for it. There should be a contract, right? So that they actually get paid and what is expected of them, and what the people, the organizations that are paying them, what their expectations of that organization are. What if there's a cancellation? Are they paying flights? Are they getting a per diem for food in addition to their stipend? There should be a contract. And also, are they going to get a 1099 at the end of the year? If you earn money, you need to pay taxes if it's over a certain amount. So there's all kinds of ongoing legal issues that are never really explained. Also, when survivors are first starting to be public about their experience, nobody tells them that, things that get out there can be Googled by these little devices. And do you want to be protected? Do you want to be safe? So I think there's a whole host of legal issues.
Yeah, you just answered another question of why lawyers are so important in this fight against combating sex trafficking, because there is so much like behind the scenes that people don't really look at, but then lawyers and people like you that actually know the struggles of a survivor, they know how to deal with those things. They know how to help survivors once they leave the cycle. And that's why lawyers are so important in this fight.
Good lawyers, not necessarily all lawyers, but lawyers who are trauma informed and who understand that in addition to the specific legal issues that need to be solved or advised on, that there's a whole host of complex trauma that can't, um, that must be taken into consideration and cannot be ignored when you're solving someone who has been through, really traumatic situations, is probably living with a PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah, can you actually touch on that? Because the way I met you is that you came to a coalition meeting, you talked about trauma and how to deal with trauma, or how to or consult someone that has severe trauma. Can you talk about the importance of trauma counseling and why that's so important, especially when dealing with survivors?
Sure. So, I tell my students this, the future lawyers of the world, I tell them, you guys are going to go out into the world and you are going to solve other people's legal problems. And when you frame it like that, if someone has a legal problem, it's not a shiny, happy thing
Yeah,
for the most part. Sometimes it is. It could be buying a house that's exciting or adopting a child that's exciting. But by and large, people are seeking out an attorney because they've got a problem they need to solve and they can't do it by themselves.
yeah,
Everyone walking around in the world has experienced trauma. Everyone. But everyone's experience is personal. And, whether it be a pet that's died, a grandparent, a parent, a sibling, witnessing something really terrifying. We've lived through a pandemic the last 14 months, and that's very traumatic. But again, every single person's experience is unique as we all are. And I think it's really important that when someone who's coming to you who has been a victim of a crime of violence, which is what sex trafficking is,
yeah,
you have to expect that they are somehow um, going to present with trauma. And when we're talking about the legal problem of cleaning up someone's criminal record, at least here in Pennsylvania, part of that process is filing an affidavit. And they have to explain, and our law states with particularity. So that means in detail what happened to them.
hmm,
And when you sit down and talk with someone about their trafficking experience and you're asking them to tell you with particularity in detail
yeah,
what happened, it's probably going to re-traumatize them.
yeah,
And it may not in that moment, right? People who have been through trauma have an ability to sort of compartmentalize and shut it off and talk about it as though it happened to someone else. But when they walk out, it could hit them. And what are their coping mechanisms? Do they have a community of support around them? And so I think it's really important to recognize that they could break down, they could not want to talk about it, they couldn't be ready.
yeah,
And people who seek out lawyers are the client. They are the ones who drive the bus. They are the ones who ultimately make decisions based on information that the lawyer gives them. Lawyer, can advise, but ultimately it's the client. So it's really important to be aware of what trauma is, how it can come up, if your client has a community of support around you, and whether or not, I'm just pulling up my list so I don't miss one, you are working with, the 5 key components of
yeah,
what's considered trauma informed care. And I think that, here we go. Here's the 5 of them. The first one, I talked about it just a minute ago, is safety. It's physical safety, but it's also emotional safety. Like, are you in a good place in your life
hmm,
where if you do have a co-occurring substance use disorder, and every single one of my clients does, most of them are in recovery, is talking about what they lived through going to trigger them to want to use again, which can be really scary. Because
yeah,
if you have heroin addiction, especially in Philly, you could die if you use, because our heroin is laced with fentanyl. So we want to make sure that our clients feel physically safe and are emotionally in a good place to start peeling back the layers of talking about their victimization.
hmm,
Also, building trust with your client. It isn't up to me to say, hey, we have attorney-client privilege. That means that anything you tell me, with a couple of exceptions, like you're going to, hurt yourself or hurt a child or kill
yeah.
somebody, like, right? Anything you say to me, I can't say, so you can trust me.
It's not that easy.
No, it's not up to me to tell you, Oliver, that you can trust me. It's up to you to decide if I've earned your trust.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So You can earn trust by being clear with expectations, clear with procedures, clear with how it's going to go. Say, could go this way, could go that way. Not sure. I think it's going to go this way, but be very clear. Don't overpromise.
Mhm.
Also, give your clients choice. Like, they're the ones that drive the bus.
Yeah.
Work with them, meaning you're a team. You're going to collaborate together and then ultimately empower them, right?
Yeah.
Give them the skills they need to feel comfortable and confident to make their own decisions about their legal problems.
Yeah. I mean, it's all, I think trauma enforcement, especially for people that work so closely with survivors, is really important. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how much trauma survivors really have and how
Yeah,
hard it is to really connect with them and get them to trust you.
sure.
And so you just kind of just went over how necessary it is for someone to, or how someone dealing with the survivor is able to gain trust and how they're able to help with the trauma they've received before.
Right.
Um, you also, since you're a lawyer, you also do a lot with legal advocacy. Um, can you explain how important, like, fighting for certain legal rights for survivors or like combating sex trafficking as a whole is important? Like, how important is legal advocacy in this fight to combat sex trafficking?
So I think it's really important. You know, I think it's important to understand that every state and the federal government has a penal code or crimes code, right? It's all the crimes and they're written down in the books, on the law books. And, state crimes are things like murder and burglary and driving under the influence and selling drugs and robbery, all the things that you might see on Law and Order, right?
Yeah.
But there are certain elements to these crimes. So when you're investigating a burglary, you have to prove certain things. And if you're the prosecutor, you have to prove them in a court of law to
Mhm.
a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. When I first started doing this work, not every state had a trafficking law. Pennsylvania didn't have a good one. There weren't elements to a crime. And so I think it's really important that when the states were writing their trafficking laws, they did so clearly with clear elements that prosecutors could prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
So the states had to go to their crimes codes and add in a crime of trafficking.
Hmm.
Every state and Washington, D.C. also has a crime of prostitution or the sale of sex. Sometimes that crime is written in the exact same section in the same, the same that's buying sex. They call it soliciting sex in some states. Well, should the selling sex and soliciting sex be in the same section? I don't think so.
Hmm.
Should selling sex even be a crime? I don't think so. So some of the legislative and policy advocacy means asking legislatures to take things out of the crimes code. They were
Hmm.
put in the crimes code, way back when for a purpose that people weren't informed about to try to,
Yeah.
police crimes of morality or obscenity. And now we know a lot about trauma and why prostitution exists, and we should really change that.
You kind of just touched on it, but you also touched on it before when you were talking about how you got into this line of work. Why do you think that sex trafficking is so stigmatized in like in legal terms? Like, why do you think it's like so bad? Why do people think it's so bad that like prostitution is so bad and that it has to be criminalized? The prostitute has to be criminalized for what they've done. Why do you think that whole genre of like sex trafficking and prostitution is so stigmatized in our country?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think historically, if you look back, it was, that woman who
Yeah.
was promiscuous or out of wedlock or looking at through a lens that was very immoral or obscene,
Mhm.
not realizing that women who are in, don't want to call it a business, but who are selling sex
Yeah.
might be doing so others can make money. That
Mm.
means there's a trafficker, but they're selling sex to someone who's willing to pay for access to someone's body. But if you look at media and pop culture, they continue to perpetuate the stigma that surrounds prostitution. Now,
Yeah. Sure.
you and I are talking about prostitution and sex trafficking, and we already have a very clear understanding that there is a distinct difference.
Yes.
One of the reasons why it's so important to understand that you cannot have a conversation about sex trafficking without also having a conversation about prostitution is because of the following reason.
Mhm.
Legally, the purpose that has to be proven in a court of law to prove the crime of human trafficking is a commercial sex act.
Mhm.
Commercial sex act. That's prostitution, right?
Yeah.
So not all prostitution has trafficking, meaning that there is, force, fraud, or coercion involved, or that someone was recruited through coercion to sell sex.
Mhm. Yeah.
Some people might choose to sell sex, not have a pimp, not work in a brothel, be freelance, post their own ads, never get hurt. Not all prostitution is sex trafficking, but every single act of sex trafficking involves a commercial sex act.
Mhm.
And Oliver, can you tell the difference between someone just by looking at them, whether or not they're in prostitution or they're a sex trafficking victim?
No,
Me either.
I
And I
can't.
do this for a living and I have lots of clients, and I've been, as a prosecutor for 10 years, I've been doing this work for almost 10 years. It's a long time.
Yeah.
I can also tell you that a lot of clients that I have, in fact, I had a conversation with one last week who said, you know, when you met me, that boyfriend I had, he was my pimp.
Did she not realize that it was her pimp until she left, or did she know it was her pimp?
She knew it was a domestic violence relationship.
Mhm.
She knew that they both had co-occurring heroin addictions, right? Substance use disorder. Um, he was violent with her. She thought it was domestic violence.
Yeah.
I don't think that I think she knew that something was wrong, that she wasn't in control, but she also wanted to feel some kind of like power over her own life.
Yeah.
And I first met her in 2007. So
Yeah.
how many years later is she telling me this?
Yeah.
Right? So
Crazy.
while she was in the life, she didn't want to acknowledge it, recognize it. No one wants to be called a victim.
That also goes back to the trauma of like the of denying and denying that you were actually part of it. And that's true for a lot of cases, that a lot of prostitutes or a lot of people that have been in sex trafficking don't even realize that they were trafficked until years later because of the trauma that they try and like brush under the rug or they try and hide.
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard so many survivors, especially some survivors who speak nationally and who are amazing, who I'm sure you've heard from, say things like, "Well, yeah, when I was in the life, it was we had our own little world and we felt like we were part of our world and everyone else was other."
Yeah.
If you are someone who is seeking out being part of a family or part of, we all want connection, right? You other everyone else. So to look at what you thought of at the time was like your choice to be there, or just something you had to do to make money because that's what he made you do. You don't want to label yourself
Yeah.
someone who'd been victimized. And you also, like, most women I talk to want to have power over their life, want to feel like they are in charge. And so when you're in a traumatic experience, you'll change your normal to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I mean, it's the sad truth. It
Yeah,
happens
it is.
all the time.
But also, it's part of it is good, because if you think about it, the way that we are hardwired just as human beings, it's to survive.
Mhm.
Why people are able to survive being prisoners of war, they just change their normal to cope. And part of being trafficked is your inability to leave your trafficker. So it's, if you're an adult, it's kind of like kidnapping. If you are a kid, it absolutely is kidnapping.
Mhm.
But just because you can open the door and walk out doesn't mean that your brain isn't telling you that if you
Yeah.
leave, terrible things are going to happen. So you have to normalize your situation just to convince yourself that you're going to live through it.
Yeah, exactly. It's survival instincts.
Yeah, definitely.
You said earlier that you founded or you were co-founder of the CSC Institute. Can you explain what that is and what the whole purpose of the CSC Institute is?
Sure. So we are the Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation. And the reason we decided to call ourselves the Institute to address commercial sexual exploitation instead of the Institute to address sex trafficking is exactly what I talked about before.
Mhm.
Not all prostitution is sex trafficking. All sex trafficking involves a commercial sex act that is prostitution. But I also really believe that being purchased for sex is exploitive.
Yeah.
And I believe that prostitution is a crime that is rooted in gender-based violence. And we need to start talking about what is exploitive
Mhm.
in a sexual context. And whether or not you're paying someone for a sex act, is that by consent? There's always a power imbalance, especially when money is involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when we created the Institute, we kind of went to the drawing board, and I'm just going to pull this up on my other computer here so I don't miss something
Go
because
ahead.
it's kind of long. But we created a mission that we actually went back a couple of times to change, just to make it very, very clear about what our purpose was.
Mhm.
So we wrote a 4-paragraph mission statement that talks about what we do, right? It's to educate and provide technical assistance to those who respond to commercial sexual exploitation in Pennsylvania, the US, and beyond,
Mhm.
promoting victim-centered, trauma-informed, multidisciplinary collaboration. So that means we train people about what trafficking and exploitation is. After we're done training them, if they need help or want to come back to the drawing board and talk through things, that's the technical assistance piece. It's anyone who responds. It could be law enforcement, prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys, legislators, teachers. I've trained the Department of Transportation, including the people who work at the DMV,
Really?
and anyone. And it's really important that when we're talking about it, like, I'm a lawyer,
Yeah.
solve legal problems, but I can't do my job all by myself. I'm not a social worker, right? If there's a criminal case, I'm not the detective involved. I'm not a recovery specialist. I'm not a housing specialist. So I have to work with a team of people. We all have to be on the same page to walk alongside the person that we're trying to support. And we can't do it in silos. And kind of the way I describe it is, those kids that go to the sandbox and they get in the sandbox and they've brought their toys to the sandbox and they sit in the sandbox, but they hold all their toys on their lap and they don't share. And there's like this whole fake playing in the sandbox because they're sitting there and they're holding their toys, but they're not sharing.
Yeah.
I really think it's important for us to collaborate. That means get in the sandbox, bring your toys to the sandbox, and share your toys with everyone else.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what's the point of playing?
Yeah.
So that's the first part. The second part is equipping policymakers and the broader community with the skills and the knowledge needed to improve the legal system's response to commercial sexual exploitation, to support survivors and hold perpetrators accountable. Again, advocating for the equality model is front and center of that policy work. People in prostitution should never be criminalized.
Can you actually touch on that really quickly, just about the education or the equality model? My bad.
Sure, of course. So the equality model is one of 4 sort of policy positions on prostitution. And there are actually 4 policy positions. There's the status quo, the equality model, decriminalization, and legalization. 4. People really in the US are talking about 2. They talk about decriminalization and
Yeah.
they talk about the equality model. But they forget that the status quo means prostitution is a crime everywhere, buying sex is a crime everywhere, sex trafficking is a crime everywhere, the pimping, the brothel owning. I believe that the equality model is the best solution, meaning people in prostitution, whether or not they have a trafficker, should never be criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Choice for most for lack of choice. If we want to stop the sex trade that ultimately harms those in prostitution, no matter what you do, you can't get around the physical harm and the emotional harm. So we need to target the traffickers who are making money by selling a person, the sex buyers. Every dollar that goes into a trafficker's pocket comes out of the wallet of a sex buyer. They're the ones that make that market grow. And then the third party facilitators, like, have been kind of in the media a lot lately, are the hotel industry, where the managers are making extra money on the side to let it happen in their hotels.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only way, in my opinion, to target and shrink the sex trade. And there's decrim, meaning people in prostitution and those who buy sex and those who run brothels just shouldn't be targeted for criminalization at all.
Mhm.
And then legalization does not happen in the US except 10 counties in the state of Nevada where the legal brothels happen, but it's in Germany and Amsterdam and New Zealand and Austria where they are state regulated. The state, you have to pay taxes, the state gets a cut. But at the end of the day, the people who are working, selling sex in those brothels, including the brothels in Nevada, aren't the ones making the big bucks. It's the owners of those brothels.
Yeah, and it's just further perpetuating that cycle. And
Yeah,
so you are so can you just talk about the harms of full legalization of those? I know you just kind of touched on
sure.
it. Like
Sure.
like
So full legalization is what's going on in Germany, uh, the brothels in Nevada,
mhm,
New Zealand. And if you look at in Amsterdam, right? Everybody talks
yeah,
about the Netherlands and Amsterdam. And if you actually take the time to look to see who is selling sex
mhm,
in the brothels in Germany and Amsterdam, they aren't German citizens. They're not Dutch citizens. They're people from war-torn countries like Eastern Europe, like Russia. I have a friend who's a lawyer in Vienna, Austria, who represented 17 victims who were being trafficked through the brothels in Vienna who were Cuban.
mhm.
You know, they aren't German citizens and the daughters of the German politicians and the elite business owners, right?
Mhm.
It's people who don't really have a choice and are just trying to survive.
Yeah, it's the
Also, what's happening in Germany is that in those brothels, I believe a substantial amount of the brothel owners were convicted of trafficking. They're making so much money.
mhm,
What goes hand in hand is the traffickers are trafficking their victims through those brothels. They're managing them.
yeah,
Nobody's looking at them as traffickers. The women don't speak German. The sex acts that they are being required, they can't say no,
mhm,
even though the law says that they can say no. They can't say no. There's no choice.
yeah,
Are violent. There's a lot of acting out of what is seen in violent pornography. So also, if you look at the review boards like Yelp, where these men who are buying sex legally are going on and like rating the commodity they bought, just like the hamburger they ate for dinner,
yeah,
they're really dehumanizing the women. They're referring to them as this thing or that. There's violence depicted. It's not good
not
stuff.
good. It's not a good look. And that's I'm pretty sure a lot of actually American states are trying to legalize the same thing.
They are. There's a real push right now for what a lot of sort of progressive policymakers are calling consensual sex work.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what that means, consensual sex work,
Yeah.
because again, of the things we talked about, right? Is somebody going to say like, no, I don't want to be doing this? Well, people need to eat. People need to have a place to stay. Um, right. So you're going to make money to keep your kids, to keep from losing your kids no matter what. Like, I can't imagine being a mom about to lose my kids. Like, I would do anything, right, to save my kids, to keep my kids safe. And is the person who's buying the sex, if you don't want to, can you say no? Because he's the one with the money and he's in the position of power. And I say he because the majority of people who buy sex are men.
I mean, yeah.
So there's a real power dynamic. So can being paid for sex, does that equal consent?
Yeah, it's so weird because whenever there's money involved, there is really no consent because the person's obviously like the victim, we're gonna say victim in this case, is obviously needs the money for something. And the John is the only person that has the money. So therefore she's kind of forced to have sex with them because of her own needs. And so there's no real consent in that interaction. And that's why it's so
Very coercive dynamic, right?
very coercive.
And I think, I work at a university, I work in a law school, and I'm around a bunch of college kids and law students who are just barely out of college. And there's a whole conversation happening. And I'm sure all of you kids in your high school kid, I'm sure you guys are talking about this too, the sugaring phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
where you've got college kids thinking like, oh, I'll sign up and I'll get myself a sugar daddy and he'll buy me a pretty pocketbook. Really?
Yeah, people don't know it's like actually like it's a form of coercion because it
Yeah,
can lead to so many different other things.
right. And if you don't have sex, is he still going to give you the pretty pocketbook or pay that tuition bill that you thought you had or pay down your credit card bill? Do you
Yeah,
have the ability to say no?
I know. It's yeah, it's literally coercion.
Yeah,
Right?
really.
But that was a sidetrack. I do still want to hear about the mission statement of your
Oh, right. Yeah, mission statement. So the third piece of our mission statement is we center the experience of survivors to inform the development of policies and best practices to combat commercial sexual exploitation. And we're committed to engaging the survivor community in shaping our positions. And the reality is, I'm a lawyer and I know how to write laws. I know how to advocate to get those laws passed. Um, but if I'm doing that for a population that I haven't asked their opinion, about how that law would have affected them while they were in the life or now, then I'm not doing it, in my opinion, in an ethical fashion.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
really important that we ask survivors that we're working with them and work alongside them as a team, not as a hierarchy, but as a team to move the ball forward as we're changing laws and policies.
Yeah,
Because the reality is, it doesn't impact me. I am not a survivor of sex trafficking and exploitation, but I'm a lawyer who's very passionate about this work and wants to make the world better.
yeah.
So, how can I help or could have helped you if you had had someone like me in your life at the time? I think that's really important. And
Mhm.
then the last piece is we aim to create a community in which every human being is treated with dignity, compassion, and respect. And that is inspired by Villanova University's Catholic Augustinian mission, because we are a Catholic law school.
Perfect. And have you this is the first time I've kind of ever heard of something like this is the first time I've ever heard of an institution that does kind of what you do. Um, is
No one,
it
no one else does what I do.
I know that's why it's so amazing. That's why I wanted to interview you because you do so much of this legal work and education nobody else really does because like I said earlier, it's so stigmatized. And like you said earlier, even your colleagues made fun of you when you tried to do something different, you tried to really help. And that's why I think it's so amazing of this institution that you co-founded because it really does help and it really does work. And
There
that's
are, a lot of, there are a lot of really good people that we work alongside with, right? Like the World Without Exploitation has coalition members who
Mhm.
do policy work or who do direct legal services or who do education. But to do it out of a law school where we have the ability to provide free legal services, to talk with other people who are legal professionals. Like I had something come up where like a legislator wanted to introduce a law that I knew in my heart was unconstitutional. I took constitutional law in school. I'm not a con law lawyer, right? And so I was like, this is unconstitutional. And someone said, well, why? And I'm like, because I know. But because I'm here, I was able to go to my colleague and say, I know this is unconstitutional. Tell me the framework. Tell me again why. So it's like it's a really neat space to
Yeah,
kind of be able to do all of this, knowing that you have all of these professors with a niche business and knowledge and scholarship on their one area. It's kind of cool.
yeah. That's why it's so amazing because you really are able to do so much and help a lot.
Yeah.
That's what you've done, and that's why you're so amazing, and that's why you're able to help so many people.
Thanks.
Um, Also, you also do a lot with educating. Like I said earlier, that's what you did with me. That's how I met you, is because you were educating us. Um, how important is educating others about both like policy advocacy, legal work, trauma enforcement, things like that? How important is educating others, especially like police officers or like you said, even transportation people or like bus drivers or the DMV people? How
Right.
important is it to educate them about this issue?
I think it's really important. I think that one of the reasons why trafficking flies under the radar and people get away with it is because people don't know what to look for. They don't have a language for it,
Mhm.
or the media has sensationalized it, made it cool with lingo. I mean, even the cartoon Disney movie Turbo talks, the snail talks about pimping his shell.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a way that we need to sort of reframe the conversation and talk about the reality of what's important. You know,
Mhm.
so many, I call them the old head detectives, and they laugh at me, think of like, well, she's just in prostitution because she has a drug problem.
Mhm.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? So, like, let's take a step back and unpack that a little bit. How do you think she got into it? Why do you think she does this? Do you think she wants to do this? Do you think she needs help? Is there someone controlling her money? Is there someone giving her a place to stay? You know, and if you really unpack it with them and do it in a way that isn't like, this is the way that it is, I'm telling you the way that it is, like, let's think about this critically together,
Yeah.
try to come to solutions, because no one wants to be told the way that they've been doing things or thinking about things is the wrong way.
Yeah.
And it may have not been wrong at the time, it may not be completely wrong. um, but I take the standpoint where I don't want to polarize people. Yeah, I am a feminist.
Mhm.
I am pretty opinionated, which is not easy to always, hear my opinions. But I also want to be able for you to walk away, you meaning anyone, walk away from a conversation and say, that was thought provoking. I'm going to think a little bit more about that.
Mhm.
It's almost like your mom gave a TED talk. I gave a TED talk. So it's almost like you want to talk about it and you don't want people to shut off. You
Yeah.
want them to stay on the train until the train stops. And then when the train stops, they want to like continue on the train ride. You
Exactly.
know, the way of bringing people along with you. And I find that in this fast paced world of like constant information at your fingertips, changing, new, inundated, what are you going to stop and unpack issues and think about things critically?
Mhm.
um, we have to make the time for. It makes us better students,
Yeah.
makes us better educators, it makes us, I think, better listeners.
Definitely.
And it's not something that's easy to do. And that's a big piece of this.
Practice.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this is why I did the whole thing, because I think education is so important, and like educating others about this whole issue to really like change the way our society really looks at this issue, and through that we're able to like change the outcome of change the outcome. And that's why I think education is so important.
Yeah.
And that's why I love that part of your mission statement of helping educate everyone you can to really combat this issue that this pandemic, this global pandemic that we're all living through. And
Yeah.
that's why I love education and educating others, and people to educate others to help.
Are
Uh,
you are you going to be an educator when you grow up? Go get out of college, all your things.
I have no idea what I want to do. Still trying to figure that out. Everyone's like, what do you want to do when you're older? I
my
have
my advice to you is this: do whatever makes you feel like passionate and invigorated,
uh-huh.
something that you care about.
I
'Cause if
do. I care a lot about this. That's why I did this. But as for like what I want to do for like adult stuff, I have no idea. I think about it all the time. I still have no idea.
I will tell you that I am old enough to be your mother, if not older than your mother, and I still sometimes don't have it all figured out.
No, it's complicated.
Life's complicated, it really is, but I think that having these really important conversations and doing it in a fashion that is a dialogue that asks people to think about things that are like, let's talk about QAnon. You and I know that QAnon hijacked the anti-trafficking movement. They
Mhm.
hijacked it. Hashtag save the children, making up numbers, making up lies about people wearing their COVID mask. If they had their child wear a mask to protect them from COVID, they're going to get kidnapped and sold into these pedophile trafficking rings.
Mhm.
The reality is, the majority of the people, especially in the US, are trafficked by someone they know.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I think that it's really important to ask people, where are you getting your information? What are they backing that up with? What are the facts? Who else have you talked to? And I think that's what's so important, right? It's not being like, you're stupid, you're a QAnon supporter. You might think that in your heart,
Yeah.
but let's unpack that.
Mhm.
Did you read that in more than one media source? What
Yeah.
was the media source? Did you go to the source that the media used? Did you look at the law enforcement data about that? Was there really a child reported missing? So I think that, it can be really difficult to confront people about something they think is their true belief, but there's a way of doing it that makes them curious, right? I just want everybody to be curious. If you think something and you're passionate about it, read all of the things. Don't just get spoon-fed and think that's the way that it is.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a big, I think a lot of people just go with whatever they see first.
Yeah. And if I went with whatever I saw first every time I opened my Twitter feed, whoo, oh my.
I know, it'd be insane.
Yeah,
I
crazy,
wouldn't know what to believe.
crazy, crazy. Oliver, this has been such a pleasure. Do you have any